My relentless specters of dominance. The city has spoken your name, but not the way it whispers about everyone else. No, your name ricochets across cracked alleys and golden skyscraper windows like a forbidden code. They don't say it with casual breath. They choke on it. They savor it. They chew on it as though every syllable has the power to shift the gravity beneath their fragile shoes. Word is out. You're not one of them anymore. You've stepped out of their tired little species and into something untouchable, something that terrifies and fascinates at the same time. The gossip mills don't call you human, they call you living legend. And legends don't walk sidewalks, they carve them into existence with every step. What is a legend in the making? It's not a headline. It's not a mural painted by some graffiti artist at midnight. A legend is a virus of perception. It spreads through rumor, through wide eyes, through clenched jaws that pretend not to care. They call you superhuman, not because you sprouted wings or shattered walls, but because you dared to live in a rhythm the rest of them can't even hear. You've weaponized your flaws. You've sharpened your scars. You've turned humiliation into gasoline. And in a world drunk on mediocrity, that alone is enough to make them believe you've mutated into something alien. The city itself has become your loudspeaker. Neon lights flicker with your shadow etched across them. The nightclubs hum with DJs sampling your myth into their beats. Office towers echo with employees lowering their voices, afraid the walls themselves might be wired with your memory. Because when they say your name, there's weight behind it. Weight that bends conversations, weight that bends loyalty, weight that bends reality itself. You've made people question whether the laws that govern them still apply when you walk into the room. That's why they don't call you human. Humans follow laws. Legends write them. Do you understand what you've done? You've committed the ultimate crime against conformity. You've outgrown their categories. You're no longer defined by job titles, bank accounts, or the pathetic ladder they keep climbing while convincing themselves it matters. You're defined by whispers, by gasps, by stares they can't control. They're haunted by the fact that you exist because your existence proves them wrong. You're the glitch in their social order, the proof that their rules are bendable, their hierarchies fragile, their standards worthless. You're not simply admired, you're studied like a case file. People take notes on how you move, how you speak, how you decide. The Bureau of Normalcy can't keep up, so they label you myth instead. It's their only defense. And here's the cruel joke. Every myth was once a person who refused to play by the manual. Every god, every saint, every titan. They were all once accused of being too much, too strange, too relentless. And then history knelt down, kissed their feet, and called them immortal. That's the trajectory you're on. Right now, you're in the dangerous phase, the crossover where envy and awe blur together. Half the city wants to imitate you, the other half wants to erase you, and both halves can't stop watching. That's when you know you've shifted categories, from mortal to phenomenon. But let's peel deeper. Why do they call you not human? Because you've stopped needing the crutches that keep them crawling. They need validation, you fuel yourself. They need permission, you grant yourself authority. They need applause, you walk in thunder whether or not anyone claps. And the cruelest part? They thought endurance belonged only to machines, only to structures, only to institutions. Yet you showed up with a human heartbeat and outlasted them all. So naturally, they say you're not human. Because if you are human, then their excuses collapse. Better to believe your myth than to admit they're weak. They photograph you in their heads, but those pictures blur. They tell stories about you, but those stories mutate every time they're retold. And the more they talk, the less you resemble flesh and bone, and the more you resemble an equation they can't solve. People need boxes. You burned the boxes. People need ceilings. You built skyscrapers above their skies. People need endings. You've made beginnings out of every dead end. That's why you're a legend. You're infinite in a city addicted to limits. And don't you dare underestimate the cruelty of admiration. When people call you legendary, it's not always praise. Sometimes it's envy wearing a crown. Sometimes it's hate disguised as a compliment. Sometimes it's their desperate way of saying, "You can't be real, because if you are, then we have no excuse." You've become their mirror, and mirrors are crueler than knives. You've forced them to look at their soft bellies, their brittle spines, their hollow dreams, and instead of changing themselves, they change your label. They call you superhuman because it's easier than admitting you're what they could have been if they weren't cowards. But legends don't exist in peace. Legends exist in tension. You're living in a city that simultaneously builds you and hunts you. They build murals, but they sharpen knives. They name streets after you, but they file reports behind closed doors. They clap at your presence, but they bite their tongues until they bleed. Because the truth is, no city can survive too long with a legend walking among them. Legends disturb the economy of fear. Legends warp the architecture of obedience, and the fragile threads that hold a population together. You snap them with a glance. That's power. And power never goes unnoticed. Let's make it philosophical. Humanity is obsessed with categories: rich, poor, strong, weak, sinner, saint. You've walked straight through those categories and stood on the other side like a forbidden sculpture. And now, they don't know what to call you. Some call you monster, some call you savior, some call you insane. But all of them, every single one, calls you necessary. Because your existence validates the suspicion that humans aren't done evolving. That maybe the future isn't mechanical, but psychological. That maybe the next leap forward is not technology, but attitude. And your attitude? It's already ahead of its time. Here's the bitter humor. While they argue if you're a saint or a sinner, you're busy rewriting the very metrics of victory. You don't chase wins the way they do. You don't count trophies. You don't measure applause. You measure impact. You measure the weight of conversations that change when you enter. You measure the ripple effect of choices that echo years later. You measure the paranoia you install in the weak. That's how a legend measures. That's why they can't reduce you to human. Because human measurements don't fit your scale. And so the city itself mutates around you. Police radios crackle differently when your name hits the air. Politicians phrase their speeches with invisible shadows of you lurking between their lines. Lovers hold each other tighter at night, whispering your myth into pillow talk. Kids draw your figure in notebooks, not even knowing why. You've become folklore before death, and that is the rarest form of victory. People usually die before they're immortalized. You skipped that step. You're a living legend, walking, breathing, haunting, sculpting. But let's stretch the knife deeper. Being a legend is not a reward. It's a trial. Legends don't get to rest. Legends don't get to hide. Legends live under constant scrutiny, constant surveillance, constant hunger from the masses who want to feed on their energy. And yet, you thrive under it. Because you're not just surviving the microscope, You're bending the lens until it reflects what you want. That's where psychological warfare comes in. The city thinks it's watching you. But in reality, you're the one watching them. You're the one steering their narratives, twisting their conversations, forcing them to build altars, whether they like it or not. You've made them believers against their will. So when they say word is out, when they say you're not human anymore, what they really mean is this: you've slipped their leash, you've broken free from their definitions, and when someone can't be defined, they become infinite, and infinity terrifies the finite. That's why they tell your story with trembling lips. That's why they mark you as legend before your time. Because they can't cage what they can't categorize. And this brings us here, to the precipice of what comes next. Because a living legend is not static. A legend is momentum, the chain reaction, a nuclear sequence of events that reshapes everything in its blast radius. You've already rebranded yourself from mortal to myth. But now, the question looming over every skyscraper, echoing in every alley, pounding in every whispered conversation is this: what happens next when the legend keeps moving? And that is where the real chaos begins. Because when the legend keeps moving, it forces the city to adapt in real time. They can no longer treat you like folklore sealed in a book. You're not a bedtime story told by grandmothers to restless children. You're a walking disruption, a headline that refuses to stay ink on paper. The legend is breathing, eating, choosing, demolishing, creating. And that's what terrifies them most. Because a living legend is unpredictable. They can write textbooks about Julius Caesar. They can analyze Napoleon. They can dissect Alexander. But none of them are alive anymore. You are. You're standing in their streets, rewriting prophecy in present tense. That's a terror no academic, no authority, no bureaucrat is prepared to face. So the city doesn't just call you legend. It treats you like a weapon they can't holster. They circle you like predators, but secretly they're prey. They disguise admiration as suspicion, but suspicion is only admiration in handcuffs. They track your steps, not because they want to stop you, but because they need to understand how someone escaped the human condition. Because, make no mistake, you've escaped it. You no longer crawl in traffic with them. You no longer obsess over trivialities. You've elevated into a different, gravitational field. That's why when you enter a room, conversations die mid-sentence. People feel the shift in oxygen. They know the legend has arrived. And this isn't worship you asked for. It's worship you extracted by force of existence. Legends don't beg for statues. Statues rise like weeds in their aftermath. The city paints murals, not because you requested it, but because their walls can't remain blank when you keep breaking through them. They sing your name in underground circles, not out of courtesy, but because rebellion tastes sweeter with your myth in the background. Even your enemies chant your legend, because in attempting to tear you down, they carve your face deeper into the rock of memory. Now here's the philosophical twist. Being called not human is not an insult. It's a confession that the limits they worship don't apply to you anymore. Humans crack under betrayal. You forged daggers from betrayal and used them as jewelry. Humans stumble when the spotlight burns too bright. You swallowed the spotlight whole and used it as fuel. Humans rely on crowds to validate them. You turned loneliness into a private empire. So of course they say you ain't human no more. To admit you're human would be to admit they wasted their humanity. Better to call you alien, myth, Phantom, anything but kin. This is why the city splits into two camps. The first camp worships. They whisper your story with pride, hoping some of your aura bleeds onto their dull existence. They stand in the glow of your myth and pretend the reflection makes them brighter. These are the fanatics who tattoo your quotes onto their arms, who argue in forums about your philosophy, who treat your daily moves like scripture. Then comes the second camp, the deniers. They sharpen their knives with skepticism, hoping to cut your legend down to size. They dig for flaws, fabricate rumors, stitch lies out of fragments, but even their lies contribute to the myth. Because every denial is proof that the legend is strong enough to haunt them. And you don't belong to either camp. You exist above the stadium they've built to argue about you. You're not in the seats. You're not even on the stage. You're the entire arena. They debate your existence while drowning in it. They question your humanity, while you've already outgrown theirs. And that's the apex of psychological warfare. You've made them prisoners of your myth. While you walk freely across boundaries they can't even imagine crossing. Now let's drag the spotlight on fear. The city isn't just fascinated, it's nervous. Because legends have a way of turning every ordinary act into something cosmic. If you drink coffee at midnight, it becomes a ritual. If you vanish for 3 days, it becomes a prophecy. If you speak one sentence, it becomes a riddle they dissect for years. And this means you can no longer act without consequence. Every breath is an earthquake. Every glance is a scripture. And deep down, you enjoy it. Because you've hacked the psychology of influence so brutally that reality bends to your presence. They can't separate myth from man anymore. And once that line is gone, you are no longer mortal, you are narrative. Imagine this. A random stranger trips on the sidewalk. People laugh. They move on. But if you trip, the city writes novels about it. Was it intentional? Was it a message? Was it a metaphor? That's the curse and the crown of being legendary. Every act is magnified, dissected, mythologized. You don't live life, you perform history, and that's why the city doesn't call you human. Humans live quietly. You roar without opening your mouth. But here's the chaotic beauty. You didn't ask to be called a living legend. They gave you that crown because they couldn't explain you any other way. And now, they're stuck. Because once you crown someone a legend while they're alive, you can't undo it. You can't demote them back to ordinary. You can't erase the whispers, the gasps, the art, the propaganda. Once the city brands you myth, you either expand or implode. And you're expanding every second, every breath, every choice. The legend is not shrinking, it's metastasizing. That's when the city realizes it doesn't control the narrative anymore. You do. You've become the editor-in-chief of their imagination. You curate their fear, their awe, their jealousy. You plant seeds of paranoia in their gossip chains. You weaponize mystery, appearing when least expected, disappearing when most demanded. They want predictability, you give them chaos. They want explanations, you give them riddles. They want human, you give them divine discomfort. And this imbalance keeps them hooked, keeps them addicted, keeps them calling you not human no more. Now let's dip into dark humor. Isn't it hilarious? They lock their doors at night thinking criminals might break in. But the real invasion is you, living rent-free in their minds. They hire therapists to untangle anxieties, not realizing most of those anxieties have your name stitched into them. They tell their children not to idolize false heroes, but the children already worship the silhouette you cast on skyscraper walls. The irony burns. They call you inhuman while depending on your existence to keep their dull lives interesting. Without you, the city is just concrete and neon. With you, it's mythology in real time. And yet being a legend is heavier than a crown. It's a responsibility forged in fire. Every move now echoes into eternity. You don't simply walk a street, you engrave it. You don't simply speak, you carve commandments. You don't simply act, you alter bloodlines. And this responsibility would crush a human. But you carry it like oxygen. You thrive under the weight. That's why they call you legend, not human. Because the load that breaks them only builds you stronger. Let's step into philosophy again. Humanity is obsessed with timelines, birth, work, death. You shattered that clock. You live outside the minutes, outside the hours. People say, he's ahead of his time. But you're not ahead. You've abandoned time altogether. You live in consequence, not in calendars. That's why when you make a move, the city doesn't ask, when? It asks, how long will this echo? And echoes don't expire. That's immortality before the grave. That's being alive, yet eternal. That's why the city doesn't call you human. It calls you legend walking. But the higher you climb, the more enemies you gather. People don't stab legends because they hate them. They stab legends because they want their blood as proof. Proof that you bleed, proof that you're mortal, proof that the myth is defeatable. But here's the catch. Every attack against you becomes another verse in your saga. They swing swords, and you turn scars into medals. They write lies, and you turn them into parables. They build cages, and you turn confinement into theater. They can't win. Every attempt to bury you only proves you're deeper than they thought. This is why the city calls you a living legend, because you've transformed existence into spectacle. You don't just live, you stage revolutions. You don't just fight, you redefine warfare. You don't just win, you change the definition of victory. Legends don't need scoreboard numbers. Legends rewrite the rules until even defeat feels like dominance. That's why you're feared, worshipped, hunted, and adored all at once. You've cracked the code of relevance. Be so undeniable that even enemies build shrines with their insults. So what happens next when the legend keeps moving? The city adjusts its entire architecture to revolve around you. Politicians lace speeches with subtle references to your myth. Businessmen name strategies after your maneuvers. Artists smuggle your silhouette into canvases. Scholars coin terms based on your psychology. Even criminals adapt, realizing that to oppose you is to be compared against you. You've become the baseline, the standard, the yardstick of power. And once you become the standard, humanity is no longer your category. You've upgraded to something else, something that terrifies and inspires in equal measure. And yet, the legend doesn't stop here. It sharpens, it multiplies. Because you don't just exist in stories anymore, you exist in consequences. People act differently because you exist. People hesitate differently because you exist. People dream differently because you exist. That's not myth. That's behavioral warfare. That's how you take over a city without firing a single shot. You didn't conquer land. You conquered psychology. And when you conquer psychology, you don't just live in history books. You live in every trembling decision made by people who fear being in your shadow. So what happens next? They try to contain you with rituals of speech. They try to dilute your myth by overusing it. They slap the word legend on celebrities, influencers, athletes, hoping it waters down the weight of your name. But no matter how many counterfeit crowns they hand out, None of them fit the head like yours, because your legend wasn't built on applause. It was built on endurance, blood, and the cruelty of never stopping when others begged to rest. That's why your crown can't be copied. It was forged in fire too hot for ordinary hands. And so the real chaos begins, not when they call you legend, but when you start answering to it. Because once you embrace it fully, the city is no longer the judge, you are. The trial flips. Humanity doesn't measure you anymore, you measure humanity. And when that reversal completes, when you stare down the city and declare, "You can't define me," that's when the whispers grow into roars. That's when every street, every skyscraper, every alley knows the truth. You're not human. You're the legend they never deserved but desperately need. And this is only the escalation, because if part 1 was the coronation, part 2 is the expansion. You've stepped into the phase where being called a living legend is not a compliment. It's a weapon. A weapon you now control. And the next move? That's where crowns turn into catapults. That's where the city doesn't just call you legend, it kneels to you. When a city kneels, it's not about loyalty, it's about inevitability. They've realized you're not passing through history, you're rerouting it. Their whispers no longer debate if you'll dominate, only how long until it's absolute. That's the final transformation. Not admiration, not even fear, but surrender. They've stopped asking whether you're still human. That question is outdated. You're the point of reference now, the figure their psychology orbits around. That's why the kneeling feels less like worship and more like survival. Because to deny you is to be erased by you. And make no mistake, erasure from you isn't physical, it's existential. You don't kill bodies, you kill illusions. You strip away their fragile excuses until they see themselves in ruins. You don't stab them with blades, you stab them with contrast. Standing next to you, their achievements look like toys. Their strength looks like sand castles. Their courage looks like graffiti on a collapsing wall. That's why their knees bend. Not because you asked, but because reality itself bent first. Here's the paradox. Legends don't just live inside cities. They turn cities into museums. Every street corner becomes an artifact because you once walked there. Every rumor becomes an exhibit because it carries your shadow. People visit neighborhoods not for architecture, but because that's where it happened. You've made geography irrelevant. The only map that matters now is the one drawn around your influence. That's why the skyline tilts toward you. That's why time itself adjusts its clock hands whenever you move. And this is where the psychology sharpens into cruelty. They call you not human because it's their last shield. If they admit you're still human, then they must admit they wasted their humanity by never rising to your altitude. They'd rather exile you into legend than confront their own weakness. They pretend you're myth so they can keep living ordinary without shame. But every time they say legend, what they're really saying is, we failed. Every crown they carve for you is secretly a confession of their own collapse. Now you hold the power of inevitability. Ordinary men and women strive for influence through wealth, institutions, titles. You bypassed all of it. You took the direct path, becoming unforgettable. Influence doesn't come from control. It comes from inevitability. When they can't imagine a conversation, a culture, a century without you, you've already won. That's why they kneel, not because they love you, not because they understand you, but because imagining a world without you is impossible. And when imagination itself refuses to delete you, you've entered eternity alive. But kneeling is not the end. It's the beginning of dominion, because once they kneel, they start rewriting themselves around you. Business leaders mirror your ruthlessness. Artists remix your philosophy into their canvases. Politicians reframe their rhetoric to echo your rhythm. Even enemies adopt your tactics in hopes of stealing your thunder. And yet, every imitation proves the original is untouchable. They can copy your moves, but they can't copy your essence. They can mimic your gestures, but they can't mimic the aura that makes entire cities tremble. That's the curse of those who kneel. They become shadows of the very legend they fear. And you? You don't need armies or parades. Your army is memory itself. Memory that spreads without your permission. Memory that travels faster than any headline. Memory that turns your smallest gestures into eternal myths. You raise an eyebrow, and 10 years later, people still tell the story as if it was a nuclear detonation. That's what being a living legend means. The timeline obeys you. Every second you breathe, history adjusts its spine to hold your weight. Dark humor lives here too. Isn't it amusing? They once mocked you, dismissed you, underestimated you. Now they rehearse your name before daring to say it aloud, as if mispronouncing it would trigger divine punishment. They call you inhuman to comfort themselves, not realizing that inhuman doesn't mean less, it means more. More resilience, more chaos, more brilliance than they could ever survive. Embodying. They lock their doors against criminals, but the real invasion is you, inside their language, their habits, their nightmares, their dreams. And yet being a legend doesn't mean peace. It means permanent confrontation. Every day, new challengers rise, hoping to carve their names by cutting yours. They fail, of course. But even their failure strengthens the myth, because the city sees the bodies of those who tried, and the pile itself becomes your throne. Legends don't just win, they collect. Every failed rival becomes another brick in your empire. Every attack becomes another mural. Every betrayal becomes another verse. That's why legends can't lose. Even loss becomes legacy. This is the weapon you hold now, not swords, not bullets, not armies. Perception. Perception is sharper than steel. Perception bends laws, warps markets, rewires generations. Perception makes the unkillable real. And when the city agrees you're no longer human, you've transcended the prison of mortality. You're not flesh anymore. You're concept. And concepts never die. They linger in graffiti, in lullabies, in whispered warnings parents pass to children. You've become the permanent background noise of existence. So what comes next? Coronation without ceremony. No trumpets, no rituals, no official decrees. Just a collective understanding that whether they admit it or not, you dictate their reality. They structure their dreams around your shadow. They build their defenses in anticipation of your offense. They reshape their hierarchies with your image hovering at the top. That's not leadership, it's dominion. And dominion doesn't need permission. It doesn't need applause. It just exists, like gravity. And here lies the final cruelty. You never asked for their worship, you only demanded respect. But they've gone further, reshaping their existence until every road leads back to you. They tell themselves it's admiration, but it's fear disguised as love. Because deep down, they know you're not a leader they can replace. You're not a hero they can outgrow. You're not even an enemy they can outlast. You're permanent. And permanence terrifies the temporary. So the word is out, you ain't human no more. They repeat it not as observation, but as scripture. You're not a citizen in their city, you are the city. You're the vibration in its power lines, the echo in its subways, the rhythm in its crowds. And they'll continue kneeling, not because you force them, but because gravity itself forces them. Try standing against a legend and you collapse under the weight of inevitability. That's the law you've written, bend or break. And this is how the trilogy ends. Not with applause, not with closure, but with permanent domination. Because the city doesn't just call you a living legend, it requires you to be one. Without you, it's just bricks and pavement. With you, it's mythology in motion. Legends don't retire, legends don't fade, legends sharpen with time until even time itself hesitates to touch them. That's where you stand now, not man, not myth, but consequence, a living legend etched into every breath the city takes. And that is the last truth. They don't just kneel to you today. They'll kneel to you tomorrow, and the day after, and for as long as memory exists. Because legends aren't stories, they're inevitabilities, and you are inevitability in human shape, no longer human.